It's time for the Douglas Coleman Show. Smooth and Savvy is joined by some of the hottest talent in the entertainment industry, from musicians to authors and all those in between. And now, ladies and gentlemen, here he is, Mr. Smooth and Savvy himself, Douglas Coleman.
Well, hey there, hi there, ho there. You're as welcome as can be. Welcome to the Douglas Coleman Show. Glad to have you here. It's me. Thank you for tuning in. Always nice to be with you. We've got authors today, two authors. The first one is Jim Cosby, who is an author and also an attorney, and he's written a book called Devil's Music, Holy Rollers, and Hillbillies, How America Gave Birth to Rock and Roll, which is certainly something I'm interested in as a musician. So he will be up first, followed by Garry Berman, who has written 4 books that we're going to talk briefly about. We're going to see the Beatles, Best of Britcoms, Between the Laughs, and Perfect Fool, the life and career of Ed Wynn. So he will be up second. Before we get to the interviews, however, we do have a song. This is another Music X-Ray submission. Oh, I just hit the microphone. Sorry about that, folks. This one is called Far Above the Ocean, and the band is called Pulaski Skyway, spelled P-U-L-A-S-K-I, Skyway. The lead singer is a female, and I got to admit, she sounds a bit like Edie Brickell. That's what I thought when I first heard this song. Edie Brickell, as you may know, had a couple of hits back in the late 80s, early 90s, I think. And she's also notably Paul Simon's wife. This song is called Far Above the Ocean. It's a nice song. I really enjoyed it. So we were going to play the song and then straight into the interviews.
Looking down.
Okay, please welcome my guest, Jim Cosby. Hi, Jim. How are you?
I'm good, Douglas. How you doing?
Very good. You are an attorney, and you're also a music writer. When you say music writer, does that mean a songwriter?
No, just an author.
As in you write about music, not write music.
Right.
Okay. But you are an attorney. What kind of law do you practice?
Right now I'm doing sort of some general litigation, kind of corporate stuff. I've previously done some, a little bit of entertainment law, but right now just sort of some general corporate litigation.
Well, since you've done entertainment law, before we get to your book, I did want to ask you about the Led Zeppelin case, since that is about music. Did you follow that case at all?
I did a little bit. I did not a lot. Just the fact that I still don't know why exactly they waited 20 years.
The problem with that case for me was that the original songwriter, a guy named Randy California, he never wanted to sue Led Zeppelin, and he had 40 some odd years to do it. Once he died, whoever inherited his estate, they immediately filed lawsuit. And so to me, that just reeked of opportunist and greed, not really about, we need to protect his artistic integrity, because otherwise he would have done that himself. And he specifically said he had no interest in suing. It wasn't until after he died that the lawsuit was initiated. So I'm really glad that the jury that they threw it out, that they ruled in favor of Led Zeppelin, because I think motive should be a factor in deciding those cases. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Well, it definitely can be a factor with the jury. I think there can be a lot more. I think music's really personal to people, and I've done a little bit of copyright work, and there's definitely a lot of sympathy involved. People love music, and they don't really want to see anybody get ripped off, I don't think. So I think even if legally they had grounds to bring it 40 years later, it certainly wouldn't have helped them with the jury.
That was the whole point for me, was that the original songwriter, he didn't want to sue Led Zeppelin.
It's an interesting area of the law, because, sometimes you think, well, everybody, a lot of music sounds similar. And, there are people out to just rip people off and have these nuisance cases. But then sometimes, there's, it goes both ways. Have
you heard both songs? I mean, there is that similar riff, the guitar riff.
Right. Yeah, I did listen to it a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah. But, I don't know. It just, like I said, the whole thing about it being done 40 years later by someone else, that, that just stinks to me. But the jury went the way I would have liked them to go. So I'm happy enough with the results. Anyways,
yeah.
Let's talk about your book. I just received your book, by the way, a couple of days ago. Thank you very much. I have not had a chance to read it yet, but I will get to it as soon as I can. But thank you again for sending that. That was very nice. The book is called Devil's Music, Holy Rollers, and Hillbillies, How America Gave Birth to Rock and Roll. Tell us a little bit about the book. Give us a kind of a synopsis, if you would.
Sure. I'm a lifelong rock fan, like a lot of people. Like I know you are, I think.
Oh, yeah.
And at some point I realized, I really didn't know how exactly it came about. I mean, I had a rough idea, there was black guys in the Delta playing the blues, and then there was Elvis Presley. But I realized, I didn't know what was the first rock record, how exactly did it come about? And I was, curious about race. How did we go from this totally segregated music and, society was so segregated in the South? How did it all of a sudden become integrated? And the more I looked into these questions, the more interesting it got.
So what kind of research did you do for the book? I mean, where did you start?
Well, I was reading about Elvis's roots, and what I realized is that, all this rock and roll, sort of the foundation for everything he did, was already in place in Memphis. So, there's of course there's tons written about rock music and then the blues, but nobody seemed to tie it all together. You can read about the Delta blues, you can read about Elvis, you can read about country music, but nobody, and most rock history books tend to start in the mid 50s. So I really went back to, books, that are already out there on all those different topics from the Delta blues. And eventually I traveled to Memphis a couple of times, but mostly, I actually worked my way backwards. I worked from Elvis back to Memphis before Elvis. And then I jumped back to the blues, and that's the way I wrote the book. It sort of almost goes backwards for the first part of the book because I'm just sort of looking backwards, into the roots, just sort of tracing out these roots of where this stuff came from.
Well, people like Eric Clapton and Jimmy Page, since we were talking about Led Zeppelin, they really were heavily influenced by the stuff that was sort of pre-Elvis, like Robert Johnson, who was, certainly a blues player. There was a famous quote by Colonel Tom Parker who said, "If I can find me a white boy who can sing like a Negro, I could make a fortune." He found Elvis, and he did make a fortune. I guess the music was already there, but it wasn't being played on white radio stations because everything was segregated, correct?
Right. And that was Sam Phillips said that.
Close enough. Okay. Stan Phillips, right. He was the guy from Sun Records, right?
Right.
So kind of take us through the book. So the book starts out when? Like what year?
What I do is I really start talking about America in the 50s, just sociologically. I think people sort of know that, there was a lot of conformity in the 50s, but I really want to, this idealized view of the 50s of things being pretty orderly and everybody's happy, but there's a lot of unrest. There's a lot of tensions and unrest. So I kind of go through, there's like cracks in the foundation. Just like one example is Eisenhower in one of his State of the Unions in like 52, I think, 53, he's talking about how the country, like there's like this anxiety in the country. And I just thought that was really interesting. That was the president of the United States talking about there's this angst, and because it's the nuclear age, faster paced and all this. So I really kind of break down American society in the 50s, and I think things that I didn't really know, that there was a lot of unrest already. And then from there, I jump back to the blues, and I actually start with Robert Johnson. And the reason why I started with Robert Johnson is, again, there's one of the themes of the book is that sometimes I think we know some of this story, but we don't really know it that well. Like, for example, Elvis is a good example, but also Robert Johnson, and as like most people have heard, or a lot of people have heard, there's this myth that this great bluesman, Robert Johnson, had a deal with the devil, and that's why he became this great bluesman, which is kind of a crazy story. And of course, he was, maybe the most influential blues guitarist ever. But really, at this point, we actually know quite a bit about Robert Johnson's story, and so there's this actual guy who lived in the Delta in this brutal conditions of the Mississippi Delta, a black man in the first half of the 20th century. And so, I sort of like dissect that myth. And sort of, you just say, he probably did not do a deal with the devil. We could be pretty clear he didn't. And then, so that I kind of use that as to say, that there's a lot of myths we just sort of accept.
What years was he active? I don't know that much about him. I haven't read that much about him.
Right. He recorded a little bit in the early 30s, and he passed away in, I want to say, 37. So he was not a national act. He was never a national name until many years later. So he was passed on directly through people like Son House and then B.B. King, through the Delta. But he recorded some songs, and the people in the Delta knew of him. Cornerstone of the Delta blues.
He wasn't a big star.
Right. He recorded, so he had records out and he sold it, but he was not a star at all. And outside the South, he was unknown.
So what was it about him that people like Clapton and Jimmy Page really took notice of?
Well, those guys, technically, and I'm not a guitarist, but he just had a unique style that really influenced everybody else. Like he was like Son House, who's a pretty famous bluesman, directly learned from him, and then sort of indirectly Muddy Waters, like all these guys really, were heavily influenced by Robert Johnson. And Johnson had sort of a boogie line in his blues. And, I'm not a guitarist, but there's a famous quote where Keith Richards, the first time he heard Robert Johnson, because he had such a special style, and he played this really low, almost like a bass on his guitar at the same time, Keith Richards heard him playing solo and said, this Robert Johnson guy is really great. Who's the other guy playing with him? Because
it sounded like two guitars, right?
Right. Just so innovative and unique.
Okay, so then how far does the book go? Okay, you start back in, the 1930s?
My approach is that, you can't really understand rock unless you understand the blues. And then with the blues, to really understand the blues, you kind of have to understand slavery and the end of slavery. So I actually stepped back to, a lot of this music, whether it's the blues is rooted in work songs, slave music. And then, so I talk a little bit about slavery and slave music and how that ended, because that's where you get, the black gospel, Negro spirituals and all this, the roots of the blues, came out of slavery, and then the blues came shortly thereafter.
And going forward, where does the book end?
Right. So then I traced everything forward up until basically my real focus is on how rock and roll comes together in the mid-50s, and then I stop at basically like 1960, once that first wave of rock and roll is sort of ended.
It seems to me that what's considered popular music runs 30-year cycles. At least it has, since the ability to record music. Jazz was pretty much considered popular music from 1920, let's say, till the 1950s. And then rock and roll from the 50s to about the 80s. And then rap from the 80s till now. Now it's been 30 years. What do you suspect might be the next type of music to come?
So one of the things I learned was, you almost can't predict these new genres. I think, it's people didn't predict the blues, people didn't predict rock, like they just happen. I think it's pretty hard to predict. I really don't know. I right now I think there's a lot of I listen to a lot of dream pop, it's sort of synthesized post rock guitar music, which I think is really fascinating. I was expecting maybe something out of even the rapper MIA came out with some big songs like this, hip hop but world music a couple years ago. The song Paper Planes was a big hit. I could see something coming from third world countries. I really don't know. I think it's $1 million question.
Well, music seems to have changed in the way that it's created these days, where it's much more computer enhanced than human enhanced. I hope it goes back to the more human approach to music, because I think it's losing its soul. If the computer is doing more of the work than the people are, the soul of the music is getting lost. And I think that's a shame, because when I listen to stuff that is primarily computer-based, it doesn't do it for me. But if I put on an old album of something from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, or old jazz albums, great. It hits you in that spot. The newer stuff doesn't do it. It doesn't hit the spot for me. So, I hope it comes back to something on more of a human approach. So how is your book doing, by the way? Is it on Amazon? And
it's on Amazon. It's doing all right. It's not a #1 bestseller, but it's I've gotten some pretty good reviews, and I'm still trying to get it out there. It's a small publisher, good publisher, but not Random House. So
okay, how long has the book been out?
A couple of months.
Are you planning on writing another one?
Yeah, I want to. I kind of already started sort of a psycho-socio history of modern rock as well. So I would just pick up where this one leaves off in 1960.
Well, the 60s and 70s is a great time for rock music. That would be a really terrific book, to carry it on, go through the Beatles and through the 70s with all the singer-songwriters. And then, you can kind of watch it die right about MTV time in the early 80s.
Yeah, there's just, there's a lot been written about it, but, I think there's a lot more to be said. I just discovered things, this is like the biggest, arguably the biggest cultural movement of the 20th century. And, I wasn't really sure how it came about. Pentecostal church is like a huge player in the story. An unknown, like Sister Rosetta Tharpe, like somebody who's kind of bizarre. Like she's passed away 40 years ago, and she's starting to get all this attention in the last few years. And I mean, she's like a key player, and nobody knew who she was for 40 years now.
What did she do? I've never heard of her.
Yeah, it's nuts. So the title "Devil's Music, Holy Rollers, and Hillbillies." The Devil's Music refers to the blues. Holy Rollers is this Pentecostal church connection. Then Hillbillies is the white country guys. So Tharp was a huge gospel star in the 30s, 40s, like really big time gospel star. Like she, sold a lot of records, was well known, played with all the big jazz bands at the time. She actually crossed over, kind of crossed the sacred line into the secular music, played with all the big bands, and she was Pentecostal raised, right, which is the quote unquote Holy Rollers.
Right.
And so she brings us this amazing excitement. African-American woman who is an amazing electric guitar player. When I first discovered her, I already knew that Elvis, Little Richard, and Jerry Lee Lewis were all raised Pentecostal, which I thought was really interesting. So just doing some research, I looked at, I was researching Sister Rosetta Tharpe, and it turns out all these first rock and rollers were hugely influenced by her. I mean, like Johnny Cash and Little Richard said she was their number one favorite singer. Elvis, Sam Phillips, everybody in Memphis and the rock scene were huge fans. And so I started to realize like this woman is like this linchpin who really connects. She's she's like the heart and soul of this book, because she really connects the church, the black church, to the white, quote unquote, hillbillies. And her style, this really high energy style of music she played in the 30s, 40s, and into the 50s was just huge.
How much stuff is out there with her? I mean, how much media? Did she do a lot of recordings?
She has tons of recordings. I don't know how many albums. I mean, I have her greatest hits, I think, but she has several albums, several compilations out there on her. I'm not sure how many records she sold. One measure is when she got married in the early 50s, she did it at the baseball stadium in Washington, D.C., and there was 25,000 people there. It was a little bit of a PR stunt, but I mean, she was big. She was really a big star. Is
there any film on YouTube?
Oh, yes. I actually, talk about one of the videos in the book. Like, it's shocking. You'll see it. If you can look up Sister Rosetta Tharpe. I would start with Up Above My Head. And she's actually, it's really crazy. Like, I think why she got forgotten is by 1955, I want to say she was born in 1915. So when rock and roll starts to really happen, she's already a little bit older, and she's really has strong ties to the church. So the rock and roll crowd wasn't really talking about her too much. And at the same time, I think because she had crossed that line into secular music, a lot of her gospel fans kind of detached themselves from her. So she's really got forgotten for, like I said, for decades. Finally, a biography was written about her like 8 years ago now. And now, all of a sudden in the last couple of years, it's really crazy. Like, she's gotten millions of hits on YouTube. Like, this woman who died in the early 70s, all of a sudden she's had this crazy career renaissance. Part of it, there was an American Experience documentary on her. And also the Alabama Shakes have, and a couple other groups, the Carolina Chocolate Drops, have talked about her a lot as being a huge influence.
Okay, well, I definitely have to look her up. Check that one out. I think we're going to wrap this up. We are kind of out of time, but I want to thank you for coming on. Hopefully your book will do very well. Good luck with it.
Thank you. Enjoy talking to you. Enjoy your show.
Thank you very much.
You're listening to Mr. Smooth and Savvy right here on The Douglas Coleman Show. We'll be right back after these commercial messages.
In-house production and recording in Louisiana Publishing Company is now offering a special for podcasters on their CD Pro Radio network. For just $20 a month, CD Pro Radio will broadcast your podcast twice a week on their network. This is a great and inexpensive opportunity for podcasters to gain some exposure for their show without having to spend a lot of money. Please check them out at cdproradio.com. That's cdproradio.com.
Go listen, download, and subscribe to The Douglas Coleman Show. It's available at the website douglascolemanmusic.com/DCS. Also on iTunes, Spreaker, and YouTube. The Douglas Coleman Show is an internationally syndicated talk and music show that features fascinating and sometimes famous guests from all aspects of the entertainment industry. The topics can range from light and fluffy to sober and serious. Our focus is on music artists, but we also feature producers, authors, directors, and even promoters. The Douglas Coleman Show. Sometimes chat, sometimes music, always entertaining. Again, it's available today at the website douglascolemanmusic.com/DCS. You can also connect with them on Facebook at Douglas Coleman Show 1, follow on Twitter at Douglas Coleman 3, and you can even find them on TuneIn Radio. Again, that's the Douglas Coleman Show at the website douglascolemanmusic.com/DCS, iTunes, Spreaker, YouTube, and more. Go listen, download, subscribe, and share with your social networks today.
And now...
Hey, Rocky, watch me pull a rabbit out of my hat.
Again?
Nothing up my sleeve. Presto! No doubt about it. I gotta get another hat.
Now here's something we hope you'll really like.
Okay, please welcome Garry Berman. Hi, Garry. How are you?
I'm very good today. How are you?
Doing very well. You've got a lot of interesting books, and I want to ask you about all of them, actually. Before we get to that, though, I'm looking at your picture. Has anybody told you look like Richard Gere?
That's come up once in a blue moon in recent years. I guess when I started to get more salt and pepper, back when it was more black, I heard Dustin Hoffman a lot. So I guess there are worse people to look like than those two.
Oh, well, yeah, certainly Richard Gere is a handsome guy. Dustin Hoffman's a fabulous actor, so you got both ends covered. I think with that. The books you've got here are very, very interesting. The first one I wanted to ask you about, because I am a huge Beatles fan, is the one called We're Going to See the Beatles. Tell me a little bit about that book. I assume it's different than the 100,000 Beatle biographies that are already out there, right?
Right. Well, that was one reason why it turned out the way it did, because I knew how many books have been written about the Beatles, and I wanted to make some kind of contribution and yet still offer something that hadn't really been done before, and also something that was within my own abilities to put together. I mean, I knew that I didn't have the budget to travel to Liverpool and London and do extensive research or speak to people who knew the Beatles. None of that sort of thing was really on the horizon for me, although I have been to London and Liverpool in the past. So to make a somewhat long story short, I thought it would be a good idea to just compile a history of Beatlemania through the eyes and ears of the original fans who were teenagers at the time that it was all happening, and who could give me their firsthand accounts of what it was like to either attend Beatles concerts or wait for them at airports or hotels. And I really, the whole thing sort of snowballed. And before I knew it, I was hearing these wonderful stories from people all across the country who really became swept up in the whole Beatlemania era. And so I consider them the stars of the book. I'm just the person who kind of put it all together in some sort of chronological order. And but to me, they're the people who really have the firsthand experiences about what it was like to be a teenager at that time.
How many people did you talk to?
About 40, just over 40.
Wow.
I think 42 to be exact, but 40 of those were done by phone interviews, and the other 2 were just by email. So either way, I managed to hear some great stories from everyone.
It was my understanding that people went to Beatles concerts that they couldn't hear the music at all, that the screaming of the girls was just so overpowering. George Martin referred to it as sounding like a jet plane. And, you know, if you think of a jet plane sitting right there with the engines going and trying to hear the music out of the little amplifiers that they had at the time, apparently nobody could hear the music, and nobody really cared because they just were there to see the Beatles, even if they looked like ants down on stage.
That's really true.
Yeah.
Some of the people I spoke with were saying how they felt privileged just to be in the same space and to breathe the same air as the Beatles, whether or not they heard the music that well or not. So I think hearing the music was sort of secondary to a lot of the people who went to their concerts. They wanted to see them and to be in their presence. And in fact, one funny story was from a woman who was a teenager at the time and went with a friend of hers to one of the concerts. And she kept warning her friend before the concert started, now, don't scream and go crazy because I want to be able to hear the music. Don't embarrass me and make it impossible for me to enjoy it. And of course, as soon as the Beatles hit the stage, that very same woman jumped up and started screaming like a banshee herself. And so it was really sort of an uncontrolled reflex, I guess, for a lot of the people at the time.
Well, I don't know what it was about them. I was too young when the Beatles, I was alive, but, I was 2 years old in 1964. And so I didn't go to the Beatles concert. I did see McCartney and Wings in 1976. It was one of the first concerts I went to. And I was 14 years old at the time that I saw that. And I tell you, I got giddy, just seeing Paul. And we were real close. This was before the Who concert where those kids got killed, and then they decided to start assigning seats to everybody. So these were like first come, first serve. So, right. we waited at the gate. We got there like at 6 o'clock in the morning and just waited all day. And finally, when we get in, we made a mad rush for the stage, and we were about maybe 2 people back from the stage. So we were looking really up, at Paul. Right. And I can just remember when he walked out on stage and he's, 20 feet away from me or something. I'm looking up and I'm just going, oh my God, it's Paul McCartney. And I had that feeling, It was so strange. And I don't know what it is. I've never felt like that with anybody else. I've seen many, many concerts of great, great musicians, but I never got that kind of giddy feeling. I don't know what it is.
Sure. Well, that's a very common reaction. I didn't see him. I was sort of a latecomer. I think it was 1990 that I don't know how I did this, but I somehow managed to get tickets to see him about a week apart. One concert in Washington, D.C., and another about a week later in Philadelphia. And again, I don't even remember how I managed to pull that off, but seeing him twice in about a week was a thrill. And I kept running that same thought through my mind as he was on stage. Wow, I'm looking at Paul. And so even all those years later, it still has that resonance to it.
Yeah, and he's still going strong, too. I mean, his concerts that were for this year, I've seen some of them on YouTube and stuff, and fabulous.
Sure.
More power to him.
I was just going to say, I'm hoping that the book I did put together can serve as sort of a historical record of sorts and a way for younger people to get a better idea of what it was like back then in the mid-'60s when the Beatles were touring. So thanks to, again, the contributors who I spoke to and the photos that they donated to me to include in the book, I think it captures that era. I like to think it captured it fairly well.
The problem is today with all of the internet technology, and it's a double-edged sword. I love having everything at your fingertips. But what it's done is it's kind of ruined the mystique of people who were like the Beatles or, big mega stars. They're not as mysterious as they were when I was a kid. I don't know exactly how old you are. Are you in my age range?
I was born in 61, so I was just a toddler at the time
okay.
myself.
Oh, you're a year older than me. All right. I was born in 62. So we're of the same generation anyways. But, during the 60s and the 70s, I mean, the only time you ever got to see the people that you idolized, the musicians, were occasionally in a magazine that would come out, and you'd rush to the newsstand to buy the magazine. You rarely saw them on TV. Back then there was, 5 channels if we were lucky. And, there were no films, there were no videos. So the only chance you ever got to see them was in concert. And the only time you ever saw pictures of them was on their album covers. You really didn't know that much about them. So the real... the mystique of them was unbelievable. Where now everybody's got a Facebook account, everybody's got a Twitter account. You know, you can find out what they're doing minute by minute if you want. And I think it's taken away some of that. I mean, it's great and it's bad. Do you know what I'm saying? It's kind of, it's both.
Yeah, although the Beatles did probably get more press than any other group ever. So, I mean, I guess they were more the exception to the rule because they were in the newspapers and magazines constantly. And I have an old scrapbook that my parents found in a New York State antique store decades ago. And it was put together by some teenage girl in Massachusetts at the time, and she cut out and pasted into these scrapbook pages just about every article she could find from Boston newspapers, the New York newspapers, and it's amazing the care that she put into this. And not only that, but just sort of it gives the impression that the Beatles were in the news almost every day, even if they weren't doing anything especially interesting or significant. So in a way, I guess they kind of broke the mold in that respect. They got so much media attention, and of course, being on TV, the Ed Sullivan Show, etc. So I think what you're saying is true for most of the other groups at the time and other singers and celebrities. But again, I think in a way they sort of maybe heralded a new era of media attention.
Well, that's certainly possible. I mean, I'm thinking comparatively, even though that they were on TV and they had many news articles and magazines, comparatively to what you can find about them now. I can remember seeing a film in junior high school. My teacher brought it in as a treat for the kids. And it was like this little 15-minute documentary of the Beatles. And it had a couple of like real grainy clips from the Ed Sullivan Show and from the Shea Stadium concert. And that was absolutely the first time I'd ever seen them move, because I had never seen, I mean, aside from A Hard Day's Night or Help, but I mean like an actual live concert footage. And, you know, now all of that stuff is on YouTube, every bit of it, you know. So that's what I mean. Sure. I just mean comparatively. But you're right. The Beatles definitely had a lot of stuff written about them, certainly more than anybody else at the time. Mm-hmm. That's for sure. They probably had as much press as the President of the United States at the time. Okay, let's move on to your other books. I want to get to them. The second one that was interesting to me, it says Between the Laughs, and it's a small picture, but I think it's Jack Benny and George Burns. Is that who's on the cover?
That's right.
Okay.
Yes.
Jack Benny is probably my favorite comedian of that time. I think his comedic timing was something that was just, it's kind of unmatched. He had a way of creating an incredibly funny situation by doing absolutely nothing. You know, the whole situation would be going on around him, and it was just his reaction to the situation that would be the funniest bit in the whole show. And I always thought that was such a great thing, you know, the less is more style of comedy is kind of what he invented.
Well, that's what so many other comedians have admired about him, both when he was performing and even today. You'll find a lot of stand-up comedians and talk about his timing and how it was just about the best of anyone ever. And so, yeah, he's way up there as far as the respect that his talents have received over the years.
I know him and George Burns were good friends for their whole life, just about. That's a nice picture on the cover.
Yeah, well, I wanted to find a picture of to sort of match the theme of the book. That is, comedians when they aren't performing, when they're being themselves. And the quotes I collected for it, I've always been fascinated to listen to comedians talk about comedy in a serious way, talk about either their own comedy or someone else's, and hear them talk about it and so maybe analyzing it a little bit, not too much, because when you analyze it too much, it kind of loses its magic and its the enjoyment that most people get out of it. Over at least maybe 10 years, I just sort of found myself collecting quotes from comedians talking about other comedians who they admired, who they maybe didn't admire so much. And so I put them together and kind of categorized them a bit. And the result being Between the Laughs.
Okay, so the book is about what they're doing when they're not on stage? This is like behind the scenes?
It's not, there aren't any jokes in it. It's not the comedians themselves being funny. It's just a collection of quotes taken going all the way back to maybe 100 years or so. Roscoe Arbuckle, the great silent film comedian, talking about what it's like for him to put together one of his comedies. And it's just seeing a different side of them and maybe getting a little insight into how they put together their comedy and what techniques they use and who they maybe borrowed a little bit from and what they considered. Not every comedian, of course, worked the same way or presented themselves to an audience in quite the same way. So you could laugh at Groucho Marx's comedy, but you could also laugh at W.C. Fields, but the two of them had very little in common as far as their comedy. And yet they were both geniuses, very popular and successful. So that's what I was trying to get at through these quotes of them sort of off stage and talking seriously about comedy.
Do you have one of Jack Benny? Something he might have said? Very
brief line from him. He was saying, analyzing or creating comedy is as delicate as making a Swiss watch. He is very careful with just the pauses, of course, his timing, the words, the economy of words. So there are just so many. I think I have about 500 altogether. Most of them, if not all of them, there's something fascinating about just seeing beyond the laughs themselves, how these comedians, how their minds worked. And I think I admire most the comedians who took their comedy the most seriously because they cared so much about it and they were very careful to get that right laugh at the right time and in the right way. And there's a lot more to it than an average audience watching them, whether it's watching them on stage or in film or on TV. You can see how there's a lot more that goes into it than most people are aware of. In my introduction to the book, I sort of compared them to magicians, how, unlike magicians who will never reveal their tricks and how they do what they do, comedians have always been a little more willing to explain or talk about how they come about their comedy and how they create it and what goes into it. So in that sense, it's sort of nice to be able to hear a little, like you say, sort of behind the scenes of what we normally see when we see them in performance.
One of the funniest things that he did that I always loved was he was actually a fine violin player, but for his comedy, he would intentionally play bad. Mm-hmm. And that's not easy to do, especially because people that are generally good at a musical instrument or particularly singing, to purposely go off key is difficult to do because most of those people have a musical ear and it's sort of built in. The muscular memory is there to play correctly. So when you've got to kind of tweak the memory to get it to go off, but just off enough so that it looks natural. Do you know what I mean?
I was thinking about that when I saw the trailers for the new Meryl Streep film about the singer Florence Jenkins Foster Jenkins, but a high society woman of the earlier part of the 20th century who fancied herself a great opera singer, but she was actually quite terrible. So I was thinking how Meryl Streep is known to be quite a good singer and how she had to do that same thing. She had to deliberately sing badly in the film to be accurate as far as how the real life singer sounded.
This is
something that came to mind.
A perfect segue into your next book, Best of Britcoms. One of the people that can also do that very, very well is Patricia from Keeping Up Appearances. When she did Hyacinth Bucket, She is actually a very good singer. I've heard her do opera on a couple of different shows, and she is quite a good singer. On that particular show, she sang horribly, but she sang perfectly horribly, just enough to irritate everybody. And I thought it was brilliant. I thought she was brilliant because, again, that's not easy to do for somebody who can sing.
True.
She was probably that show, and there was a few that I liked of the British comedies. That one was one. And what was funny about Keeping Up Appearances is, like, after you've seen it a few times, you knew that Onslow's car was coming up the road and would backfire when it got in front of her house. You knew that every single time, but every time it did it, it was funny. I don't know why. It just was like you expected it. You knew it was going to go. You could snap your fingers right at the moment that it would do it. It was still funny. Right. That show was great. The other ones I liked were Vicar at Dibley. I thought was tremendously funny. And, well, certainly Ab Fab. That's a great one. Jennifer Saunders, I think, is a genius. Some of the older ones, like Are You Being Served, I think was very funny. Tell me about your book. Tell me what's in that one.
Well, what I was going to say is that all of my books sort of stem from simply my personal likes, the things that I did the Beatles book because I'm a lifelong Beatles fan, and I decided to write Best of the Britcoms because I was such a fan of the British sitcoms that were shown on the PBS stations. And I realized that at that time, as you were mentioning before, how just so much information is available on the internet now for anything you might want to learn about. But back then, in the mid-90s, when I started working on this, you could enjoy these great British shows, but there wasn't really a way to learn anything about them, anything about the stars or how the show came into being or any of the background story. And so I kind of took it upon myself to start compiling information and making a lot of overseas phone calls to the BBC and talking with the writers and the actors and the directors. And I thought this would be a useful guide for other people like me who enjoyed sitcoms but never really had the opportunity to learn much about them. So that's sort of how that came about. A labor of love, to use the cliche. Again, with all of my books, I sit and I think of, well, what am I really passionate about? What do I really enjoy? Obviously, they're all sort of under the umbrella of pop culture and entertainment, and that's the sort of thing that I've always enjoyed, but I've always wanted to learn about the things that I liked, rather than just sitting passively and laughing at something and then moving on. I wanted to know more about that thing that was entertaining me. So again, that's sort of the root of how Best of the Britcoms came about.
On the cover, I'm looking, and is that Faulty Towers? Is that John Cleese?
Yes. I don't know if you're looking at the original edition. There was a revised edition that I added about 7 chapters about 5 years ago. But both covers, yes, do have photos from Faulty Towers.
Okay, so that's John Cleese, and then Manuel, I think, was the character's name. Right. Okay. Yeah, that was another great show. That's
a program that my feelings about it sort of evolved through the years. Not necessarily for the better. It's so widely praised as probably the greatest British sitcom of all time, et cetera, et cetera. And although I see things about it that I don't think are just that wonderful, a lot of the episodes are fairly mediocre to me. Some are, 1 or 2 just aren't that great at all. So that leaves, out of the 12 episodes that were produced, to me, maybe 9 of them were really excellent. But that's 9. There have been other British series, sitcoms that ran for much longer and maintained a wonderfully high level of consistency and excellence far longer than Faulty Towers, and shows that I personally enjoy a lot better and think are a lot funnier. So it's a very subjective thing. So I made a point of that in the revised edition of the book that, maybe Faulty Towers perhaps is a bit overpraised. But again, that's just me, and I sometimes get a little flack from that opinion. But I try to introduce people who aren't as familiar with lesser known sitcoms such as the British Empire, which was not seen much at all in the U.S., but to me is beyond Faulty Towers. Hello, Hello is a farce that took place during World War II. And it has incredible comedic invention to it that I find is just astounding, really. So, again, I just wanted to sort of spread the word about programs that now are available on DVD, and anybody, or even on YouTube, and people can try them for themselves. But back then, I just wanted to provide a source of information for the programs that did make it across the Atlantic.
I think I have to agree with you with Faulty Towers. I mean, I liked the show, but there were other shows that I liked better, that I thought were funnier. And perhaps it just wasn't my brand of humor. But I do agree with you on that one. I mean, let's put it this way. I like Monty Python a lot better. When he was with them, I thought he was much funnier than when he did that show on his own.
That's valid.
Yeah. Let's get to your last book because we're kind of quickly running out of time. This one is about Ed Wynn, and it's called The Life and Career of Ed Wynn. I don't know that much about Ed Wynn. I certainly recognize his face, and I know he was on, a gazillion shows back in the day. But I don't really know that much about him. Maybe you could just tell us a little bit about him.
Well, I guess that's a common reaction. A lot of people ask me, well, why Ed Wynn? Why did you take all that time and trouble to write about Ed Wynn? I didn't really start out writing his biography. It just sort of grew out of another project I had begun, and I was researching the history of vaudeville and radio and TV, and his name kept popping up no matter what I was researching. I just kept seeing his name and how successful he was in every medium, on stage, on radio, on TV. So I became really intrigued with his career and began researching him alone. And it sort of turns out that his career reflects show business in general throughout really the whole first half of the 20th century. He was basically a vaudeville clown. He did monologues filled with stories and bad puns and gadgets that he invented, and he wore sort of traditional clown type costume and hats, and but he had a very warm and engaging personality on stage, and that's where his first success was, on stage. He produced many of his shows himself, and then hit great success on radio as the fire chief, a Texaco-sponsored program. That's what a lot of people remember him even to this day. And then he began a whole new career in the 1950s as a dramatic actor and surprised just about everyone, including himself. So it was a very long and varied career. And so even though he's not a household name now, I kind of wanted to help correct that a bit if I could, and sort of present his career as something that really deserves to be remembered. All of his contemporaries, other comedians at the time, their nickname for him was the Master, because they had held such respect for him. So that's how that book came about, and it's really the first biography of him. And it wasn't really easy to put together because the sources of information for him were just scattered all over the place. There were very few major sources that I could look to, because no one else had really bothered to write extensively about him. So I managed to pull together what I could find, and the result I'm pleased with. And in fact, I'll be giving a lecture about him at the upcoming Nostalgia Convention in Maryland. And I'm not very experienced at speaking in front of an audience, so I'm keeping my fingers crossed that it goes all right.
When did he pass away?
In 1966.
Wow.
It's been a good 5 decades since he's been alive. And I think one reason why he's not remembered as well is because a lot of comedians from that time, they're preserved on TV. Maybe a lot of them had sitcoms. People remember Lucille Ball because they can see I Love Lucy. Or they can remember Jackie Gleason because they can see The Honeymooners.
Right.
Ed Wynn's show was on on kinescopes, and they don't really look very good right now. They didn't look very good then either. But it's not something that was really good for sort of a mass market presentation. And so he is easily seen in films, of course, whether it's, his role is in Mary Poppins, or even a couple of roles in Twilight Zone episodes that are seen all the time. So, I mean, he can be found if anyone cares to seek him out, and I think they'll be impressed with his range, both as a comedian as a dramatic actor.
That's where I remember seeing him fairly recently, was in Twilight Zone. He was like in one of the first original episodes, wasn't he? He played the guy who was, his time was up. He was going to die.
Right.
Something like that?
Or he thought, he was in 2 episodes. And the funny thing was, Rod Serling wrote he sort of rewrote an existing script for Ed for the first episode he was in, where he played sort of a pitchman who had a portable table of novelties and gadgets.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. He decided to make a deal with Mr. Death, who was about to take this girl who lived in his building who was hit by a car. So they sort of, it's an involved story somewhat, but and Rod Serling wrote that, but ironically enough, when Wynn did his role in Requiem for a Heavyweight on Playhouse 90 a few years before, there was great concern about him being able to do the role on live TV, a dramatic role, interacting with other actors, and doing this fairly extensive supporting role. And the rehearsals did not go well at all. He kept forgetting his lines, and everyone else was getting very nervous that he wouldn't be able to pull his weight when it came time to do the live broadcast. And Serling and the director, and even Ed's own son, Keenan, who was in the show, they demanded that he be taken out because they were afraid he would ruin the whole thing. Anyway, when it came time to do it live on TV, he did a pitch-perfect performance, not a flub of any lines or anything else. And that helped establish him as someone to be respected as a dramatic actor. After 50 years of being basically a clownish kind of comedian, very successful, of course, but the switchover was very difficult for him because he said he practically had to retrain his brain to work in a drama rather than as a comedian. It's a very fascinating story. I just happened to come across as I researched the book.
Well, the 4 books that you've got out, we're going to see The Beatles, Best of Britcoms, Between the Laughs, and Perfect Fool, the life and career of Ed Wynn.
Just so I thought I'd slip that in. I have a new one out.
I was going to ask you, what is your new book?
It's called For the First Time on Television, and it's a collection of over 100 firsts on television. The first sitcom, the first soap opera, the first news bulletin, everything that happened for the first time throughout the history of television, I collected in the book and categorized it. And I thought that they might be interested in knowing a little bit more about TV since everybody watches it so much. Very few people know about what was the first detective show or medical show or that sort of thing. So that's brand new.
And all of your books can be found at your website, correct?
That's right. Also on Amazon.com.
Well, Garry, we are out of time, unfortunately. Thank you so much for coming on the show. It was a lot of fun talking to you. Best of luck with your, what do you call that, a convention or a seminar?
It's the Mid-Atlantic Nostalgia Convention in Maryland, and it just brings together movies and TV and music and all kinds of popular entertainment through the years for people to reminisce and buy various items and hear other lectures other than myself and see films, etc. And it's a lot of fun.
Okay, it's called the Mid-Atlantic Nostalgia Convention. Thank you, Garry. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Well, that's about all the time we've got for the show today. I want to thank my special guests, Jim Cosby and Garry Berman. And thank you to Pulaski Skyway for the music. This is Douglas Coleman saying goodbye.